The most iconic photograph of a dead soldier from the American Civil War is staged. The man in it was moved after his death. The rifle beside him wasn't his. And the story Gardner wrote about him, printed, sold, and taught for over a century, was invented in almost every detail. This was not discovered until 1975. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments. When you look at a historical photograph, how much do you trust what you're seeing? Drop your answer below. I'll be reading them. Because what I found while researching this story changed how I look at every image from that era. Now, let's begin. I came to this topic sideways. I was researching how the American press shaped public opinion during wartime. Propaganda, framing, the gap between what happened and what people were told happened. Standard territory. And somewhere in that research, I pulled up the Library of Congress's digital archive of Civil War glass negatives. It's publicly available. Anyone can access it. And I started reading the editorial notes that accompany certain photographs. Notes written not by journalists or historians giving their opinions, but by archivists who had studied the physical negatives under controlled conditions. What I found in those notes was not what I expected. The American Civil War was the first large-scale armed conflict in history to be photographed in any systematic way. That alone is significant. Before 1861, war existed in the public imagination primarily through painting, engraving, and written accounts, all of them filtered through human interpretation, all of them made after the fact by someone who may or may not have been there. Photography seemed to change that. The camera, people believed, could not lie. Matthew Brady understood that belief, and he built an empire on it. Brady was a portrait photographer from Warren County, New York. By the time the Civil War began, he had already photographed 18 American presidents. He had won medals at the Fair of All Nations in London in 1851. He was, by any measure, the most famous photographer in the United States. When the war broke out, Brady approached President Lincoln directly and secured permission to document the conflict on a grand scale. Lincoln agreed, on one condition. Brady would finance the project himself. Brady accepted. He organized teams of photographers, built mobile darkrooms into covered wagons, and deployed them across the eastern theater of the war. He spent over $100,000, the equivalent of roughly $2 million in today's money, creating more than 10,000 photographic plates. The images that came back from the battlefields shook the American public to its core. When Brady exhibited photographs from Antietam in his New York gallery in October 1862, crowds lined up around the block. A New York Times reviewer wrote that Brady had brought the terrible reality of war to the doorstep of the city. The camera, it seemed, had finally told the truth. Reasonable, except for what the cameras were actually doing. Alexander Gardner was Brady's chief photographer, a Scottish immigrant who had come to America in 1856 and learned his trade under Brady's supervision. In September 1862, it was Gardner who traveled to Antietam and produced the photographs that made the world stop. Those images of battlefield dead, rows of bloated, twisted bodies lying in the Maryland sun, were unlike anything the public had ever seen. They were raw and they were real. But Brady took the credit. That detail matters, because it tells you something about the economy of these images, who benefited, who was erased, and what pressures shaped what the camera actually pointed at. Gardner eventually left Brady's employ, opened his own gallery in Washington in the spring of 1863, and took several of Brady's best photographers with him, including a young Irishman named Timothy O'Sullivan. On July 5, 1863, 2 days after the Battle of Gettysburg ended, Gardner and O'Sullivan arrived at the battlefield. Most of the 51,000 casualties from 3 days of fighting were still where they had fallen. Burial parties were just beginning their work. The summer heat was doing what summer heat does to human remains. The two photographers had a narrow window. They got to work. Over the next several days, Gardner and O'Sullivan took some of the most famous photographs in American history. And embedded within those photographs, documented in the Library of Congress's own archives, confirmed by over 6 decades of scholarly analysis, is a pattern that, once you see it, is very difficult to unsee. Here is what William Frassanito found. Frassanito was a photographic historian and a Gettysburg battlefield guide. In 1975, he published a book called Gettysburg, A Journey in Time, through Charles Scribner's Sons. It is not a fringe work. It is considered essential scholarship by historians at Gettysburg National Military Park. The National Park Service cites his conclusions. The Library of Congress cites his conclusions. His method was painstaking. He took Gardner's and O'Sullivan's photographs, walked the actual terrain at Gettysburg, and matched the backgrounds, the rock formations, the tree lines, the topography, to their precise locations on the field. What he found, examining 6 photographs of a single unidentified Confederate soldier, was this. 4 of the 6 photographs placed the soldier at the southern slope of Devil's Den, a natural rock formation at the southwestern corner of the battlefield. The soldier was lying on the ground. He appeared to be a common infantryman. He had no special equipment. He looked, in Frassanito's analysis, like a man who had been killed while advancing up a hillside. The other 2 photographs, the famous ones, the ones that became icons, showed that same soldier in a completely different location, 72 yards away, propped against a stone wall inside a rocky niche. A rifle leaned carefully against the wall beside him. His head rested on a knapsack. Gardner titled it Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter. I want to be precise about something here because this is where a lot of people telling this story get it wrong. The popular version of this discovery frames it as evidence of deliberate, calculated deception, as if Gardner and O'Sullivan were propagandists consciously manipulating the historical record for some sinister ideological purpose. I spent considerable time verifying that framing. It collapses under scrutiny. Here is why. Gardner was not working for the government. He was a private commercial photographer trying to sell images to a public that had an enormous appetite for the spectacle of death. More than 75% of his Gettysburg photographs focus on the human wreckage of war, a commercial choice as much as an artistic one. The staging of this particular scene was almost certainly about composition, about creating a more arresting image, about standing apart from a competitor, Brady, who was still more famous and still getting the credit. Gardner himself wrote openly in his 1866 photographic sketchbook of the war about the meaning of battlefield photographs. He wrote that such images conveyed the blank horror and reality of war. He was not trying to cover up atrocity. He may genuinely have believed he was revealing a deeper truth through a constructed image. And yet, the practical effect of what he did is not neutralized by his intentions, because here is what happens when the image becomes history. That unknown Confederate soldier, dragged 72 yards, propped against a wall, photographed with a gun he never carried, became, in Gardner's written narrative, a specific kind of man, a sharpshooter, a calculating killer who had positioned himself to pick off Union soldiers on Little Round Top before meeting his end. Gardner even wrote in his caption that he had returned 4 months later, in November 1863, when Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the cemetery, and found the soldier's body still there, still clutching the rifle, still keeping his lonely vigil. Frassanito identified 2 problems with that account. First, battlefield burial parties buried the dead within days, not months. A body left in a Pennsylvania summer for 4 months would not be recognizable as a human being, let alone as a specific soldier with his gear intact. Second, relic hunters descended on Civil War battlefields almost immediately after engagements ended. A rifle left in the open at Gettysburg would have been taken within hours, not days, hours. Gardner's entire narrative, the soldier's identity, his purpose, his solitary death, his 4-month vigil, was invention. He was not a sharpshooter. He was not killed where Gardner photographed him. He was not lying there when Lincoln spoke. And for 112 years, from 1863 to 1975, when Frassanito published his analysis, the invented story was the official story, printed in books, exhibited in galleries, reproduced in school curricula. The image became one of, as the National Park Service describes it, the most recognizable images of the Civil War. What is the soldier's real name? We do not know. Now I want to stack some context around this, because the Devil's Den photograph is not an isolated case. It is part of a pattern that runs through the entire visual archive of the Civil War. At Antietam, Gardner moved the bodies of dead Confederate soldiers to get a church, the Dunker Church, in the background of a photograph. The bodies in the original frame weren't positioned for the composition he wanted, so he repositioned them. At Gettysburg, photographer Peter Weaver, working separately from Gardner, took a series of 9 photographs at Devil's Den in November 1863 during the cemetery dedication. In those photographs, 9 live Union soldiers are posed as dead Union soldiers, sprawled across the rocks in theatrical positions of death. Frassanito documented this as well. The images were sold as authentic battlefield records. And then there is the Lincoln portrait. The most famous standing portrait of Abraham Lincoln, the one that hung in schoolrooms across America for generations, is a composite image. Lincoln's head, taken from a photograph by Matthew Brady, was placed on the body of John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator who had spent his political life defending slavery and state nullification. The papers on the desk in Calhoun's original portrait read, "Strict Constitution, free trade, and the sovereignty of the states. When William Pate created the composite, he altered the papers to read Constitution, Union, and Proclamation of Freedom. The error that gave it away was small. When Pate flipped Brady's photograph of Lincoln to match Calhoun's pose, Lincoln's famous facial mole appeared on the wrong cheek. The deception went undetected until the art director of London Picture Post magazine, Stéphane Laurent, noticed the discrepancy, decades after the image had become iconic. Each case, taken alone, has an explanation. Photographers were artists working under commercial pressure. Composites were made from limited available materials. Staging was considered artistically valid, not dishonest. Shaped, at its foundation, by people who understood that the image was not the truth of the event, but a constructed version of the truth that served a purpose. There was a soldier in the 2nd Georgia Infantry Regiment. His name may have been from a unit that fought near Devil's Den on July 2, 1863. He was very likely not a sharpshooter. He was very likely an infantryman, one of thousands killed in the assault on the Union left flank that afternoon. He died on the ground, or near it, on the southern slope of Devil's Den. Then 2 photographers carried him 72 yards. They propped him against a wall. They placed a rifle next to him that wasn't his. They tilted his head on a knapsack to face the camera. They gave him a name, Rebel Sharpshooter, and they gave him a cause, and they gave him a story about his lonely death, and they sold that story to a country desperate to make meaning out of what was, at its most literal, a field of decomposing men. Let me give you the timeline because seeing it compressed makes the pattern impossible to dismiss. July 1st to 3rd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg is fought. Roughly 51,000 men become casualties over 3 days. This is the largest battle ever fought on the North American continent. July 5th to 6th, 1863. Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan arrive at the battlefield. Burial parties are just beginning work. The photographers begin making glass plate negatives. July 6th, 1863. Gardner and O'Sullivan photograph an unidentified Confederate soldier at Devil's Den. They take 4 photographs at the original location, then move the body, 60 to 72 yards, to a more photogenic stone wall. They pose the soldier, lean a prop rifle against the wall, and photograph him again, twice more. 1865 to 1866. Gardner publishes his photographic sketchbook of the war, a 2-volume work containing 100 photographs. He writes a fabricated narrative claiming he found the soldier's body still there 4 months later. The book does not sell well. 1874 to 1875. Matthew Brady's photographic collection, representing over $100,000 in personal investment, is purchased by the U.S. War Department for $27,840. He dies in 1896 in a New York charity ward. 1865. The composite Lincoln portrait, Lincoln's head on Calhoun's body, circulates widely in the wake of Lincoln's assassination. 1961. Frederick Ray of Civil War Times magazine publishes a short article comparing Gardner's Gettysburg photographs and realizes the same body appears in 2 different locations. The article receives limited attention. 1975. William Frassanito publishes Gettysburg, A Journey in Time. For the first time, using terrain analysis and comparative photography, the full scope of the staging at Devil's Den is documented in scholarly form. The book becomes required reading at Gettysburg National Military Park. 2014. National Park Service historian John Heiser concludes, based on unit positions during the battle, that the soldier in the photograph was most likely a member of a Georgia infantry regiment, not a sharpshooter, never a sharpshooter. 2026. The soldier remains unidentified. The stone wall where he was posed still stands. His original location on the southern slope of Devil's Den is accessible to any visitor. The image of him, arranged, titled, narrativized, remains one of the iconic photographs of the American Civil War. The photograph is a monument. It is a monument built on top of a lie. Go and subscribe to this channel if you want to keep following these threads, because what I've been building across these videos is a larger picture, a series of documented cases where the visual record of American history was shaped not by what happened, but by what someone decided should be remembered, and how. The next story I'm working on is one that follows a very similar trail. I think you'll find it worth your time. But let me bring you back to the stone wall. It is still there at Gettysburg National Military Park, in the rocky niche at Devil's Den. Tourists visit it every day. They take photographs. Some of them know the history of the staging. Most don't. What they almost certainly don't think about, what I keep coming back to, is this. Somewhere on that same hillside, somewhere within a few hundred yards of that wall, is the ground where a man from Georgia actually fell and actually died. Without a name in the caption, without a narrative, without someone propping his head up to face the camera. He was the real thing. He got buried in a field. The constructed version of him became history. And here is what I cannot answer, what no one can answer, with the evidence currently available. How many of the other photographs in that archive were constructed the same way? Not the dramatic ones, not the ones scholars have studied for decades, the ordinary ones, the camp photographs, the portraits, the images we use in textbooks and documentaries and museum exhibitions as simple documentary windows into what the war looked like. How many of those windows were arranged? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does. Drop your answer to that question in the comments. I want to know what you think. And more importantly, I want to know whether it changes anything for you about the way you look at historical photographs. Does it matter if the constructed image conveys an emotional truth that the real scene couldn't? Or does the arrangement itself corrupt the record, permanently and irreversibly? The man at the stone wall never got to answer that question. He was just the body in the frame.